The air outside the airport felt heavier than I remembered, as if Oregon itself was holding its breath for me. The taxi rolled through familiar streets, now strangely foreign, and every passing mile pulled a thread tighter in my chest. It had been only 3 weeks since the retreat in Iceland, a desperate escape I took after my mother's funeral. I told myself I was ready to return, that I could face home again, but nothing prepared me for what waited at the end of the road. When the car turned onto our lane, I froze. The spot where our house once stood was now a wasteland, a flattened stretch of dirt, scattered with splinters, bricks, and the scent of dust. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I thought maybe I had given the driver the wrong address, but then I saw him, Gareth, leaning casually against his black SUV, sipping coffee as if this were any other morning. He looked up when he heard the taxi door shut. "Opal," he said, his tone flat, almost cheerful. "You're back early." I couldn't answer. The sound of my suitcase wheels dragging over gravel filled the silence. "Where is it?" I finally asked, my voice breaking. He gestured toward the ruins. "Gone, demolished 2 days ago. I figured it was time for a new start. The old place was falling apart anyway." I stared at him, trying to understand the words, but my mind refused to process them. "You demolished our home?" "Our home?" He gave a short laugh. "Come on, Opal. It was practically a museum of your childhood. The plumbing was shot, the roof leaked, and honestly, it was depressing. You said yourself after your mom died that you wanted change. So here it is." My heart pounded. "And who gave you permission to make that decision?" He shrugged. "Someone had to. You were off on your little self-discovery trip, so I handled things. You should thank me. I even used your inheritance to secure the down payment for the rebuild. It's going to be beautiful, modern, open concept, clean lines. You'll love it." I stepped closer, shaking. "You used my inheritance? Our money, Opal, that's what marriage means." I could feel tears pushing behind my eyes, but anger burned hotter. "That money was from my mother. It was the last thing she left me." He sighed as if I were being unreasonable. "Your mom would have wanted us to have a better life. You'll see. Once the new place is up, you'll thank me." Every word felt like a blade. Behind him, a cloud of dust drifted through the air, catching the sunlight like ash. All I could think of was my mother standing on that porch years ago, waving at me after college, telling me that home would always be waiting. Now there was nothing left but dirt. I turned away so he wouldn't see my face twist. "You had no right," I whispered. He smirked, stepping closer. "I had every right. You forget who's kept this family afloat. The cars, the trips, Hazel's school tuition. You think your design gigs paid for that? I've been carrying us, Opal, so don't talk to me about rights." I looked up at him then, truly seeing him. The man who once promised to build a future with me now stood as a stranger, arrogant and hollow. "You didn't build anything," I said quietly. "You just tore everything down." His smile vanished. "You're overreacting again. You always do. This is why people can't talk to you. Always the victim." My hand trembled, not from fear but from the effort it took not to strike him. "You destroyed my family's home. You used money that wasn't yours. You did it all while I was grieving, and you still think I'm overreacting?" He moved closer, his voice dropping. "Watch your tone, Opal." For a second, I saw something flicker in his eyes, something cold and dangerous. I stepped back. He turned away with a scoff, finishing the last sip of his coffee before tossing the cup onto the rubble. "I'm meeting the architect this afternoon," he said. "We're finally moving forward. You can either get on board or stay in the past." He got into his car, the engine roaring as dust spun around me. I stood there, surrounded by the bones of my old life, watching the man I once loved drive away as if nothing he'd done mattered. When the silence settled again, I sank to my knees. The ground was rough beneath me, shards of brick biting into my skin. I picked up a piece of wood, part of the old staircase, maybe, and turned it in my hands. The grain was still smooth where Hazel had carved her initials when she was 6. I pressed it to my chest, choking on the weight of everything I'd lost. The Opal who used to beg for peace, who forgave and stayed quiet, was gone. That woman had been buried under these ruins with the house. I looked at the broken land and made a promise. He thought I would stay silent, as I always had. He thought he could bury me in my own grief. But he had no idea what kind of fire loss could light inside someone. I stood, brushing the dirt from my jeans, and pulled out my phone. My reflection on the dark screen looked older, sharper. I scrolled to a name I hadn't seen in years. "Clarissa Vale," I murmured, my old friend, now a lawyer who didn't believe in losing. When she answered, her voice was the same, steady, confident, the kind of voice that reminded people not to back down. "Opal," she said, "you sound like hell." "I am hell," I replied softly, "and I need your help." Clarissa's office sat on the third floor of an old brick building downtown, tucked between a bakery and a bookstore that smelled of dust and paper. I hadn't been here in years, but walking through the door felt like stepping into a place where people rebuilt themselves. She stood from her desk the moment I entered, her sharp blue eyes scanning my face. Without a word, she walked around the table and hugged me tight. "You look like someone who just crawled out of a fire," she said. I let out a small laugh that cracked midway. "Close enough." She motioned for me to sit and poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. Her desk was stacked with folders, papers marked with highlighters, and a small photo of her daughter smiling at a science fair. The normalcy of it all made my chaos feel louder. "So," she said finally, settling into her chair, "tell me what he did." The story spilled out like floodwater. The trip, the house, the inheritance, the way Gareth spoke as if everything I owned had always belonged to him. Clarissa didn't interrupt. She just listened, her pen moving slowly across her notepad. When I finished, she leaned back, expression unreadable. "You have every right to be furious," she said calmly. "That wasn't just property damage, it was psychological warfare." I stared at the steam rising from my cup. "It's not even the house itself, it's what it meant. My parents built that place board by board. My mother died thinking it would always be ours." Clarissa nodded. "And now he's erased it to remind you he's in control." Her words hit me like a truth I already knew but hadn't dared to say. I looked out the window, watching people walk by under a drizzle. He always liked control. Even when we were happy, it was his way or nothing. I used to think he was just confident, decisive. Turns out, he was practicing ownership. Clarissa's pen stopped. "Opal, do you want out or do you want justice?" The question hung in the air. A week ago, I would have said I just wanted peace, but peace wasn't enough anymore. "I want both," I said finally. "I want him to know what it feels like to lose everything he built on someone else's pain." A small smile curved on her lips. "Then we'll make sure he does. First, we secure proof that he used your inheritance without consent. Then we go after his finances, reputation, everything he values more than you." I felt a spark of something unfamiliar but empowering. "You make it sound easy." "It won't be," she said, "but I've seen worse men fall faster, especially when they underestimate the women they hurt." The clock ticked softly in the background. For the first time in months, I felt like time was moving with me instead of against me. That night, I drove back to the empty lot. The construction crews were gone, leaving behind a silent field of gravel and twisted rebar. I stood where the kitchen used to be, where sunlight once spilled over the counter while Hazel laughed and drew pictures of imaginary cities. I could still see it, even in the dark. The wind brushed my face, carrying the faint smell of cedar from the forest nearby. Somewhere between grief and fury, something steadier began to grow. Not vengeance exactly, but the quiet certainty that Gareth would never hold that kind of power over me again. I crouched down, brushing the dirt until I found a small piece of glass, maybe from an old window. It caught the moonlight, reflecting my face back at me, tired, yes, but alive. I slipped it into my pocket. A fragment of what was to carry until I built something new. When I returned to the car, I saw a message from Clarissa. "CLA tomorrow morning. We start drafting the claim. Bring every document you have. Let's show him what happens when he picks the wrong woman to break." I smiled faintly, resting my head against the seat. The old me would have cried herself to sleep. But tonight, tears didn't come, only a strange calmness. People think revenge begins with rage, but it really begins with clarity. The moment you see the truth without the haze of love or guilt, you can finally breathe. I wasn't just breathing now, I was waking up. Somewhere deep inside the ruins of that house, a new foundation was already forming. Clarissa asked me to come back the next morning with paperwork, messages, bank statements, anything that felt heavy in my hands. I arrived with a box that used to hold holiday ornaments. The tape on the lid had lost its stick, and the cardboard was soft at the corners. She cleared a space on her desk and watched me set the box down as if it contained something living. Maybe it did. Maybe it contained the life I had been trying not to look at for years. She said we would work in chapters. Tell me about the beginning. Tell me about the first good thing and the first hairline crack. I closed my eyes and let the first chapter come back. We met at a fundraiser on the river. String lights hung above the deck and someone was playing a piano inside the boathouse. He noticed the sketchbook in my hands before he noticed me. He asked what I was drawing. I said I draw shapes that want to become rooms. He said he liked decisive women. He paid for our drinks and took my number with a grin that made the world tilt. Back then, decisiveness felt like safety. The first good thing was how easy it was to talk to him. Stories came out of me like water from a faucet, and he caught all of them with both hands. The first crack was small and almost charming. He laughed when he saw the messy corner of my studio apartment and said he could fix that with a little discipline. I thought he meant help. He meant control. It took me years to learn the difference. We moved in together after 6 months. He handled the lease because the landlord was his family friend. He set up the utilities and linked them to his email because it was easier if one person received the bills. He said shared money was a sign of trust. I said yes. I always said yes back then. The word no felt like a stone I could never quite lift. After we married, my career was a bright window I loved to stand beside. I was not famous, not even close, but I had a few clients and a few good portfolio spreads. Then Hazel arrived, and everything inside me rearranged itself around her tiny hands. I stepped back from work for what I told myself would be 1 year. He said a real family has one parent all in at home. It sounded noble when he said it. It sounded loving. He bought me a bracelet to celebrate my first year at home. I wore it while I washed dishes. I wore it while I cried in the laundry room because I missed my drafting table. Clarissa wrote quietly and then looked up. What happened when you tried to return? I told her about a small commercial redesign that fell into my lap when Hazel started preschool. It was a bookstore with a narrow back room and an owner who smelled like paper and cinnamon. I did the concept drawings at night after Hazel fell asleep. I felt alive. When I showed Gareth the contract, he frowned at the fee schedule and said my time was worth more to Hazel than to a small business that could not pay. He said any money I would bring in would not move the needle compared to what he made. He said this with a smile that looked like care. I gave the job to a friend. I told myself it was for the best. The owner hugged me anyway. My father died in winter. The house smelled like oranges and clove because my mother kept boiling them in a pot as if scent could fight grief. Gareth gave a speech at the service that sounded polished and kind. I clapped his back when he stepped down from the lectern. In the car on the way home, he complained that the coffee at the reception was weak. The silence that followed felt like a pit. After my father died, my mother became fragile in ways that scared me. Her hands shook, her memory thinned, and she started standing at the kitchen window as if she were waiting for someone who missed the turn. I split my days between our home and hers. I brought Hazel with me, and we folded laundry together while my mother told my daughter stories about when I was small. Gareth called these trips charity hours. He said I was abandoning our life for a nostalgia project. I told him this was my life. He said I would regret letting good years slip away. He did not mean my mother's years. He meant his. There was the evening with the photo albums. We were at my mother's house. The heater made its familiar ticking noise. We had tea and the three of us looked at old pictures. There was my father on a ladder painting the trim of the porch. There was my mother with a picnic basket under the maple. There was me with a cardboard sword. We laughed and cried in the same breath. Gareth came home early from a trip and walked into the room as if someone had invited him into a scene he did not understand. He stood there for a moment with his suitcase still in his hand, and then he said the room felt like a museum of the dead. He did not sit down. He did not take off his coat. My mother closed the album and told me she was tired. We never opened the albums again. Clarissa asked about money. The practical part matters, she said. Courts read numbers better than they read heartbreak. I told her about the joint account that stopped being a joint account in everything but name. He set up auto transfers. He controlled the passwords. I asked once to see the monthly statements, and he joked that I would fall asleep mid-column. When I insisted, he sent a PDF with entire sections redacted for confidentiality. He called it a business habit. He called it good practice. Good practice is an easy costume for secrecy. He liked to give me gifts that sparkled. Jewelry, a chair I never asked for, a new phone that was already linked to a cloud account with his initials. The gifts worked like quiet contracts. I felt grateful instead of curious. Gratitude is a lovely light if you hold it up to truth. It becomes a trap when you hold it up to power. There were messages. Not many, because he did not write what he could say out loud. But there were a few late-night texts, curt and clipped, telling me to stop making his week harder with my mother's needs, telling me to stop looking so tired at his work dinners, telling me to avoid topics that would distract his contacts. I saved them without thinking. I read them again now with Clarissa at my side. The words were not explicit, and yet they were. Abuse does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just erases you one request at a time. I told Clarissa about the dinner with his colleagues. We were at a steakhouse covered in mirrors, and the napkins felt like small folded flags. The men at the table told stories about real estate wins, and the women laughed at the right moments. I tried to describe a community library project I had admired in Copenhagen, a building that used a sloping reading room to bring daylight to the center. Gareth touched my wrist under the table and smiled to the men while his fingers tightened. Later in the car, he said the evening was business and that my academic detours were cute but unhelpful. I asked him what a helpful wife looked like. He said she looked like someone who knew when to speak and when to listen. The next day, he bought me a scarf the color of expensive wine. I did not wear it. Hazel grew and started seeing things I thought she could not see. She asked why Dad talks to you like a teacher talks to a kid who did not do her homework. She asked if houses make people kinder. I said sometimes. I promised myself I would build my daughter a home where questions like that dissolved in the air. Promises are easy to make in kitchens that still stand. Clarissa turned a page and asked about the day I left for the retreat. I told her the truth I had not said out loud. I left because I was afraid of what I would do if I stayed. I left because anger had begun to live in my throat and I did not want my daughter to drink from it. I left because my mother had died with a soft look in her eyes and I wanted to see if I could find that softness in myself again. The retreat was quiet and cold and clean. I was learning to breathe when the call came about the demolition. I did not answer. I kept walking through the snow and felt the trees lining the path stand taller than I could ever stand. When I landed back home, the trees were gone. So was the house. Clarissa rested her chin on her folded hands. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone who has studied weather long enough to know where the storms will go. She said we would pull bank records and title documents. She said we would subpoena the contractor who brought down the house. She said we would track the use of every dollar from my mother's gift. She said we would not let him call it a misunderstanding. We would call it by its name. I asked her what that name was. She said coercive control. She said financial abuse. She said emotional negligence. She said fraud if the documents confirm what we suspect. She said architecture is not the only field that teaches you how structures fail. Law does too. Before I left, she asked me one more question. Do you want to destroy him? I did not answer right away. The version of me that had just seen the ruins wanted to shout yes. The version of me my mother raised wanted something else. I told Clarissa I wanted truth, safety, and a future that did not smell like smoke. If justice hurts him, that is not my project. My project is a life that cannot be bulldozed. On my way out of the office, I passed a framed certificate on her wall. It said Advocate of the Year. Someone had taped a small paper star to the corner like a child does. I smiled without meaning to. I went home to a place that was not home and slept on a borrowed couch, and in the morning I drove to my mother's church. The building was simple and full of light. The custodian let me sit in the back pew. I took a letter from my bag, the one my mother wrote the week after my father died. She had left it for me with the good china. The envelope was thin with handling. I read it again slowly. She wrote that love builds and fear tears down. She wrote that a house is only a mirror and that people will either like what they see or try to smash the glass. She wrote that if someone ever breaks what you built, you must rebuild in a shape that fits only you. She advised me to find good people who stand beside windows and let light in. She ended with a line that lives in me now. The strongest walls are built from broken bricks. I put the letter back and let the sun fall across my face. The choir was practicing in another room. The music was soft and not meant for me, and yet it entered me like water soaking a dry field. I thanked her out loud. I promised her that I would not let her gift become a weapon against me. When I met Clarissa that afternoon, I brought folders as neatly labeled as I could manage. I brought my phone with every message saved. I brought a small notebook where I had started to write down details while they were still fresh. Dates, names, the time he called me ungrateful, the time he moved Hazel's college fund without asking, the time he slipped and said the land would be worth more if I got out of the way. Clarissa skimmed and nodded. She said this would be enough to open every door we needed to open. We built a timeline. We traced decisions. We highlighted the moments I had excused and called them by their real names. It was like drawing a blueprint for a building that had already been built and then discovering the beams were cracked and the foundation was crooked. You cannot keep furniture from wobbling on a crooked floor. You have to pour new concrete. You have to start over. That evening, I made pasta for Hazel in my sister's kitchen. Hazel asked if we would go back to our street soon. I told her yes, but not to the place it used to be. She asked if that was sad or good. I said it was both and that grown-up life is almost always both. She nodded as if that was the first honest thing she had heard in months. After she went to bed, I stood at the sink and watched the dark outside the window. There was a moment when I could have let anger become my only map. I could have fed it and watched it grow. Instead, I took a breath and tried to draw a different map. Revenge was a road on that map, but it was not the destination. Healing was. The route would still pass through the courtroom. The route would still expose him. But the last turn on the map would lead back to a place with light. The next morning, Clarissa called with a plan. She said Gareth had reached out to schedule a meeting about reconciliation. She said men like him often rush to reframe the narrative when they sense the ground shifting. She said we could accept the meeting on my terms. She said there are ways to make the truth stand up in a room even when a liar is speaking. I knew what she was asking without her saying it. I knew what it would mean to walk into a conversation with my past and keep my voice steady. I said yes. Before we hung up, I asked Clarissa if she believed in redemption. She said she believed in accountability first, then in whatever people choose to build from it. I looked out at the morning and thought about beams and floors and the way light moves across a room at different hours. I told her I was ready to hold a mirror to him. I told her I was ready to hold a mirror to myself too. I drove back to the lot one more time. The ground was uneven, but the sky was clear. I walked the edges the way my father used to do before he mowed, watching for holes. In my mind, I traced lines where new walls might rise someday, not the old layout. A layout that made sense for the life I wanted now. A study with a door that stays open. A kitchen where people face each other while they work. A porch where Hazel could read on summer nights with her feet tucked under her. I stood in the center and said a quiet yes to the future. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Clarissa sent the time and address for the meeting. She added a single line beneath it. Breathe. Remember who you are. Remember why you are doing this. I read it twice. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. I got back in the car and sat for a long moment with the engine off. The lot was silent. Birds moved across the wires like notes on a staff. I could taste dust at the back of my throat. I could also taste something new. It was not victory yet, but it was close to it. It was the taste of a woman who no longer asked permission to exist. It was the taste of someone ready to turn the handle on the right door. When I drove away, I did not look back. I did not need the sight of ruins to remember what had been done to me. I carried the memory inside me, but it was not a weight anymore. It was a compass. Tomorrow, I would sit across from Gareth and listen to him try to make the past sound reasonable. Tomorrow, I would let him talk until the truth stepped out from behind his words. Tomorrow would be the first real turn on the new map. Tonight, I would sleep. I would rest my voice. I would tell Hazel a story about a house that learned to breathe again and about a woman who remembered her own blueprints. And in that story, there would be a line my mother wrote, a line that would carry us both into the morning. The strongest walls are built from broken bricks. The message came in at dawn. Gareth wanted to meet. The words were polite, too polished, the kind of language he used when he was planning something. He said he wanted to talk civilly about rebuilding and finding common ground. I read it twice, then sent it to Clarissa. She called within minutes, her voice crisp with caffeine and calculation. He's trying to get ahead of the story, she said. He knows you're moving legally. We'll meet him, but on our terms. We agreed on a quiet cafe near the courthouse. She told me exactly what to do. Sit by the window for visibility, keep my phone recording on the table, act composed, let him talk. People like Gareth confess through arrogance, she said. They think control is charm. I spent the morning preparing, not with makeup or clothes, but with breath. I repeated sentences in the mirror until they felt calm in my mouth. By the time I walked into the cafe, my hands had stopped shaking. He was already there, dressed like a man auditioning for an apology. The blue suit, the careful haircut, the practiced half-smile. Opal, he said, standing as if this were a reunion. You look rested. I sat across from him, my phone beside the sugar jar. Let's talk, I said. He started with small talk about Hazel, about the weather, about the chaos of construction schedules. I waited. When he realized I wouldn't rescue the conversation, his tone changed. Listen, he said, leaning forward. This whole situation got out of hand. I never meant to hurt you. I just wanted to move us forward. You know how slow you get when you overthink. I thought if I made a decisive move, we could finally start the life we talked about. I held my coffee cup and watched the steam. Destroying what was already ours? He sighed. You call it destruction, I call it progress. Something inside me clicked. I had spent years letting him redefine words until I doubted my own. Today, the meanings stayed where they belonged. You used my inheritance, I said. Our money, he corrected automatically. I looked him straight in the eye. No, Gareth, my mother's will had my name on it, not ours. You moved the funds without consent. He waved a hand. Legal technicalities, we're married. What's mine is yours and what's yours should be ours, you know that. What's yours? I asked quietly. Because it seems everything we had was built from my parents' land, my sacrifices, my silence. His jaw tightened. You think teaching part-time made you the provider? I carried this family. You carried your image, I said. I carried the rest. The muscles in his face twitched. Be careful, Opal. You're letting Clarissa fill your head. Lawyers destroy families for fun. I almost smiled. She doesn't destroy families, Gareth. She protects what's left of them. He laughed then, a short, cruel sound. You've changed. That retreat turned you into a self-righteous saint. You think people will believe your little victim story? They know me, they trust me. I'm sure they do, I said softly. They'll like hearing you say that. I tapped my phone screen once, pretending to check the time. He didn't notice the faint red light blinking beside the napkin. He kept talking, the words spilling like gasoline. He ranted about entitlement, about gratitude, about how women forget who pays the bills. He said the house was just a structure, that I was making a drama out of bricks. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping low. If you keep pushing this, I'll make sure you regret it. You won't win, Opal. The system favors the stable one, and right now you look like a grieving mess. I felt the tremor of adrenaline but kept my tone level. You really believe that? He smiled like a wolf who thought the fence was gone. I don't believe it, I know it. That was the moment I knew we had him. Every word, every sneer, every threat now belonged to me. Clarissa appeared at the cafe door right on time. She spotted me, nodded once, and walked past as if she were just another customer. I took that as my cue. I finished my coffee, stood up, and looked down at Gareth. You're right about one thing, I said. You made a decisive move. You just don't realize which side of the line you're standing on. He frowned. What's that supposed to mean? It means progress sometimes starts with demolition. I left him sitting there, confusion chasing the last of his confidence. Outside, Clarissa joined me at the corner. Got it? She asked. I held up my phone. Every word, she smiled. Then we're not just fighting back, we're building the foundation. That night, we played the recording in her office. Gareth's voice filled the room, smooth at first, then hardening into threats. Clarissa listened without flinching. When it ended, she closed her laptop. This, she said, is more than leverage, it's exposure. Once the court hears it, his image collapses. I exhaled slowly. He'll try to spin it. He can't spin gravity, she said. When the fall starts, it's inevitable. I drove home under a sky full of thin clouds. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. I parked outside my sister's house and sat there for a long time, listening to the tick of the cooling engine. My hands felt steady again. The fear that used to hum beneath my skin had turned into something else, resolve, maybe even purpose. In the following days, Gareth's behavior changed. He texted constantly, switching from charm to anger to guilt within hours. One message read, "You don't know what you're doing." Another said, "We can fix this. Then you'll ruin everything." I answered none of them. Clarissa told me to stay silent. Let him unravel on his own, she said. Silence terrifies control freaks. It worked. After 3 days, he showed up outside Hazel's school. I saw him from the parking lot, leaning against his car again, that same stance from the day he destroyed our home. I approached carefully, every muscle alert. I just want to talk, he said. You're making things worse for Hazel. She's fine, I said. You're the one who needs to stop showing up uninvited. He took a step closer. You think you can cut me out? You think a lawyer changes everything? I built this life. No, I said, you built a cage. He blinked as if I'd slapped him. For a moment, something like shame passed through his eyes, then vanished. You'll see, he muttered. You always think you're smarter. I didn't answer. I walked past him and took Hazel's hand. She looked up at me, confused. Mom, is Dad mad? He's just lost, I said. Sometimes people get lost when they forget what home means. That evening, I told Clarissa about the encounter. She filed a restraining notice draft before I finished my coffee. We'll add this to the motion, she said. Every step he takes closer strengthens your case. Over the next week, we built our strategy like architects. Every document, every email, every memory had a place. Clarissa's office became a construction site of truth. She said trials were not about emotion, but patterns. Once a judge sees the structure of control, they can't unsee it, she said. I found old journals from the early years of my marriage. Reading them felt like leafing through someone else's life. I had written about Gareth bringing me breakfast in bed, about his jokes, about how proud he was when Hazel was born. Then slowly, the sentences grew shorter. I stopped using the word we. One entry ended with a line that startled me. He wants me smaller so he can feel bigger. I had forgotten writing it. Clarissa said it was the kind of sentence that could make a judge stop reading and think. The night before we filed, I walked again to the empty lot. The air smelled like rain. The ground was uneven, scattered with weeds that had begun to grow through the gravel. I knelt and touched the soil, damp and cold. "Mom," I whispered, "I'm doing what you taught me, rebuilding from broken bricks." Lightning flashed somewhere behind the hills, faint but visible. It felt like approval. When I stood, I noticed something small glinting near the edge of the debris. It was the corner of Hazel's old wind chime, the one that used to hang outside her window. I picked it up, brushing off the dirt, and held it to my ear. Even the faintest breeze made it sing. I slipped it into my bag and walked back to the car. Tomorrow we would file. Tomorrow the house that had been destroyed would finally start speaking for itself through papers and proof. On the drive home, the wipers beat a steady rhythm. I realized revenge was not a single act, it was a long, deliberate design. And like any design, it needed patience, precision, and a clear view of the final structure. As I turned onto my street, Hazel's laughter drifted through the open window of my sister's house. It was light and easy, untouched by the storm that had shaped me. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. The next morning, Clarissa called just after sunrise. "It's done," she said. "The filing is official. Be served by noon." I watched the sky turn pink through the curtains. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "This is only the framing. The real walls go up in court." "I know," I said, "but it's a start." She hesitated before hanging up. "Opal, remember what we talked about. He'll try to provoke you again. Don't give him the satisfaction. Let the evidence speak." "I will," I said. After the call, I opened my notebook and wrote one line across the first clean page: "He demolished a house." I'm rebuilding a life. Then I set the pen down, took a deep breath, and smiled. Outside, the world was brightening, and somewhere far away, a demolition site was just beginning to wake under the sound of hammers. This time, I wasn't afraid of the noise. It sounded like justice being built from the ground up. The courthouse loomed ahead like an old cathedral, gray stone and iron steps washed clean by the rain. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I couldn't stand sitting still. Clarissa met me at the door, calm as ever, holding 2 coffees and a folder thick enough to crush fear. "Today's about structure," she said as we climbed the stairs. "You tell the truth, I'll make sure it stands." Inside, the room smelled of paper and polish. The judge's bench was higher than I expected, the ceiling farther away. Gareth sat at the other table, immaculate in his navy suit, his expression carved from stone. He didn't look at me, but I could feel the weight of his performance filling the space. He was always good with audiences. Clarissa touched my shoulder gently. "Remember what I said, we're not here to shout, we're here to show the frame." The clerk called the case. The echo of our names bounced off the walls, distant and formal as if they belonged to strangers. Clarissa began with precision. She laid out the sequence of events like beams on a foundation: the unauthorized demolition, the misuse of inheritance, the texts, the recordings. When she played the audio, Gareth's voice filled the courtroom, smooth at first, then rough with contempt. The moment he said, "You'll regret this, Opal," a chill rippled through the room. Even the judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Gareth's lawyer tried to interrupt, claiming manipulation, context, emotional distress. Clarissa didn't flinch. "The context," she said evenly, "is a man destroying his partner's home, her finances, and then threatening her for resisting." When it was my turn to speak, my throat felt tight, but the words came out steady. I told the story from the beginning: the house, my mother's death, the day I came home to nothing but rubble. I didn't cry. I wanted the truth to sound like what it was, a record of choices. Gareth shifted in his chair, pretending indifference, but his hand tapped against his knee like a metronome. When the opposing lawyer began questioning me, he started soft, almost friendly, then turned sharp. "Would you say you were emotionally unstable after your mother's death?" "I was grieving," I said. "That's not instability, that's humanity." He smiled tightly. "But you left home for a retreat, abandoning your family." "I left to breathe," I said, "and while I was gone, my husband burned down the air." The courtroom murmured. The lawyer tried to regain control. "You're saying you had no knowledge of the demolition?" "I had none, and even if I had, I would never have consented. That house held 3 generations of memory. My daughter learned to walk there. My father built the porch with his own hands. You don't demolish something like that without consent, you do it to erase someone." The judge held up a hand. "Let's focus on the financial records." Clarissa stood, passing a stack of papers forward. "Your Honor, here are the bank transfers showing Mr. Leon, unauthorized use of Mrs. Leon, inheritance funds. The account was titled solely in her name, as per the will." Gareth's jaw locked. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something sharp. When the judge read the transcript of his recorded threats aloud, Gareth snapped. He stood, pointing at me. "You're twisting everything. You think you can rewrite history because you have a good lawyer? I built that life. I gave you everything." "Sit down, Mr. Leon," the judge said firmly. But Gareth didn't. His voice rose, louder, brittle. "She's poisoning Hazel against me. She's making me the villain. She loved the plans for that new house. She said she wanted change." The judge struck the gavel once. "Enough!" He froze. The sound of the gavel echoed like the closing of a heavy door. Clarissa stayed still beside me. She didn't need to say anything. The outburst had spoken louder than any cross-examination could. The proceedings continued quietly after that. Facts lined up like stones: unauthorized demolition permits, forged signatures, diverted funds. When the judge finally closed the folder, the silence felt like the pause before rain. "In light of the evidence," she said, "this court grants the dissolution of joint finances. All inherited and personal assets shall remain the sole property of Mrs. Leon. Custody of the minor child is hereby awarded to Mrs. Leon as well, pending further review of Mr. Leon's conduct." For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. Then the sound came, Clarissa's hand tapping twice against the table, her silent signal of victory. Gareth's lawyer tried to speak again, but his client cut him off. "This isn't over," Gareth hissed, his face red. "You'll see, you'll regret this." Security moved toward him. He shoved his chair back, sending it crashing to the floor. The judge's gavel came down again. "Remove him from the courtroom." As they let him out, he kept shouting my name, but it sounded distant, like someone calling from underwater. When the doors closed, the air felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off the room itself. Clarissa leaned close. "You did it." "I just told the truth," I said. "That's harder than it sounds," she replied. Outside, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd seen a day this clear. The rain had washed everything clean. Clarissa handed me her spare coffee, now cold, and smiled. "You're free, Opal Leon." For a moment I couldn't answer. I thought freedom would feel loud, triumphant. Instead, it was quiet, like standing in a field after a storm and hearing nothing but the wind through the grass. We walked toward the street, and she stopped to take a call. While she talked, I looked back at the courthouse. Through the tall windows, I could see the faint movement of people clearing papers, stacking files. The world was already returning to its rhythm, but my rhythm had changed. Later that evening, Hazel and I went to a small diner by the coast. The air smelled of salt and frying oil. She ordered pancakes for dinner because victory deserved sweetness. We sat by the window, watching the sun sink behind the ocean. "Is it over now?" she asked. "Almost," I said. "Sometimes it takes time for the dust to settle." She nodded, tracing shapes in the condensation on her glass. "Dad yelled in court," she whispered. I met her eyes. "He's angry because he lost control, but that's not our fault." She looked outside again. "Do you think he'll ever say sorry?" "I don't know," I said, "but I hope he learns something from this. People can change if they want to." After she fell asleep that night, I sat by the window and watched the dark waves rolling beyond the cliffs. Revenge had never been about destruction for me. It was about reclaiming the blueprint of my own life. Justice wasn't blood, it was balance. The next morning, Clarissa sent me the official judgment. The email subject line read simply, "Case closed." I opened it and stared at the words until they blurred. My hand trembled slightly as I signed the digital copy. The paper trail of my past had finally ended, but endings are just disguised beginnings. There was still the matter of Gareth's anger, the shadow that would take time to fade. I knew he would try to reach out again, not to reconcile, but to remind himself he still existed in my story. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I let it ring until it stopped. No message, silence again. I turned the phone face down, went outside, and walked barefoot through the backyard grass. The ground was soft from rain, cool against my skin. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. The air carried no orders, no expectations, only the pulse of my own breath. When I reached the edge of the yard, I could see the ocean glimmering under the afternoon light. I thought of my mother, of the letter she left me. The strongest walls are built from broken bricks. I finally understood. She hadn't meant houses. She'd meant people. The world had taken everything I thought was solid and turned it to rubble. But rubble was just material waiting to be rebuilt. I could see the new structure forming, not a house, not yet, but a foundation of quiet strength. Tomorrow, I would begin again. A week after the verdict, the news reached me through whispers. Gareth had been suspended from his company pending an internal review. His outburst in court had gone viral in local circles. Someone had leaked a clip from the courtroom, and the polished image he had built for years cracked overnight. The same people who used to shake his hand at galas now avoided eye contact when his name came up. Clarissa sent me a text. Karma works faster when the evidence is public. I wanted to feel joy, but what I felt was quieter, something between relief and exhaustion. For the first time, I didn't have to defend myself. The truth was doing it for me. Hazel noticed the difference before I did. She said the house we were staying in felt lighter, like someone had opened all the windows. I smiled at that. Children sense peace the way animals sense weather, but peace is never permanent when people like Gareth are still circling. He started sending messages again, this time in a different tone. Gone was the rage. What came instead was a strange kind of pleading. We can fix this. You're ruining both of us. I'm nothing without my family. I didn't reply. Silence, I had learned, was not weakness, it was armor. 2 weeks later, Clarissa called. He's petitioning for reconsideration, she said, but it won't hold. The evidence is solid, and the court won't reopen the case unless he finds something new, which he won't. Let him try, I said. He's good at chasing ghosts. Her laughter came through the line, low and confident. That's my girl. But Gareth didn't stop. He began showing up in places he thought I would be: Hazel's school, the grocery store, the small park near the old neighborhood, always from a distance, always pretending coincidence. The first time it happened, I froze. The third time, I took out my phone, filmed him, and sent it to Clarissa. Within days, the restraining order was official. He was served in public, outside a cafe where his former colleagues used to gather. Someone filmed that too. The man who once posed like a model of success now stood with papers fluttering in his hands, his face pale with humiliation. That night, the local news site ran a short piece titled "Prominent Developer Faces Allegations of Domestic Misconduct." His name wasn't mentioned directly, but anyone who lived in our town could read between the lines. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate in watching someone fall apart, even if that someone had tried to destroy me. But there was a sense of balance returning, the kind of stillness that comes after the wind stops. Hazel came into the kitchen while I was making tea. "Is Dad in trouble?" she asked. "Yes," I said softly, "but sometimes people need trouble to see what they've done." She thought about that, then said, "I hope he learns." So do I. After she went to bed, I sat by the window, thinking of the years that had led to this. I used to believe justice was a single moment, a gavel, a verdict, a signature. But justice was slower than that. It was a series of nights like this one, where the quiet no longer hurt. A month passed. Gareth disappeared from the public eye. Rumors said he'd been forced to sell his company shares, that creditors were circling, that his investors had fled. The same men who had once toasted him at conferences now called him reckless behind closed doors. One evening, Clarissa called unexpectedly. "You might want to know," she said. "He filed for bankruptcy this morning." I closed my eyes. "So it's done?" "It's never really done," she said, "but it's as close as it gets." I thanked her, though the words felt small compared to the weight she had lifted from my life. She told me to take a vacation, to let myself exhale. You can't rebuild while holding your breath. I thought about that all night. The next morning, I drove to the coast. Hazel was at a friend's house, so I went alone. The sea was calm, the horizon stretched wide and clean. For the first time since the demolition, I felt like I could stand still without waiting for the next collapse. As I walked along the shoreline, I noticed something half buried in the sand, a rusted nail, maybe from an old dock. I picked it up and rolled it between my fingers. Even rusted metal holds shape, I thought. You can't unmake what once had purpose. When I got home, there was a letter in the mailbox. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. "Opal, I know you won't read this. Maybe Clarissa told you to throw it away. Maybe you should. I just wanted to say that I never meant for things to go this far. The house, the money, all of it, it was supposed to be for us. I wanted to give you something better. I don't expect you to believe me, but I thought I was building a future. I didn't see that I was burning the past. Tell Hazel I'm sorry. Tell her I'm trying to get help." Gareth, I read it twice. There was no address, no signature, just those words. I folded it once, placed it in the drawer with my mother's letter, and closed it gently. That night, I dreamt of the house. Not as it was, not as it burned, but as something in between, half rebuilt, walls still open to the wind. My father's hammering echoed faintly from the porch, and my mother's voice came from the kitchen, humming an unfinished song. When I woke, I was crying, but it wasn't sorrow. It was release. 2 months later, I saw Gareth again. Hazel and I had gone to a small restaurant for dinner. He was at the bar, slouched over a glass, a shadow of the man I had once married. His suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes hollow. He looked up as I passed and froze. "Opal," he said, his voice slurred. "I wanted to call." You shouldn't, I said quietly. He laughed, bitter and broken. I lost everything. My house, my work, my name. You must be happy. I shook my head. I'm not happy, Gareth. I'm free. That's not the same thing. He stared at me, and for the first time I saw no anger in him, only disbelief at his own emptiness. You used to need me, he said. I needed peace, I answered. I mistook you for it. He looked away, muttering something I couldn't catch. The bartender moved closer, sensing the tension. I stepped back. You should go home, I said. He smiled faintly, a sad twist of the mouth. I don't have one anymore. Then he turned back to his drink, and that was the last thing he said to me. Outside, Hazel waited by the door, her small hand clutching her coat. Was that Dad? She asked. Yes, I said. Is he okay? I hesitated. He's finding his way. Sometimes people have to get lost first. As we walked to the car, she slipped her hand into mine. The air was cool, and somewhere in the distance, a train passed, long and low, like the sound of time moving on. Days turned into weeks. Gareth's name stopped appearing anywhere. His absence became a kind of presence, an empty space I had learned to live around. Clarissa said the restraining order would expire soon, but she doubted he'd try anything again. He's not a threat anymore, she said. Just a man undone. I believed her. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I still thought about him, not with anger, but with something that felt like mourning for the version of him that might have been. Revenge had given me closure, but it hadn't erased history. It had simply carved space for healing to grow. The fire inside me that once burned to destroy now burned to create. I started sketching again, nothing big, just lines on paper, small designs for light and space. One morning, Hazel leaned over my shoulder as I drew. What's this one? She asked. A house, I said. Ours maybe, someday, she smiled. Can it have a big window, the kind that lets the sun in no matter what? Yes, I said. Especially that. The doorbell rang. It was a courier delivering the finalized property deed from the court. The land where our old home had stood was now legally mine alone. I held the paper for a long time, tracing the edges with my thumb. Ownership felt strange after so much loss, but it also felt right. That evening, I drove to the lot again. The weeds had grown taller, the soil softer. I stood in the middle, breathing the scent of earth after rain. The sunset painted everything gold. I could almost hear my mother's laughter in the wind. This time, I whispered, it will be built for peace. In the distance, a bird lifted from a fence post, wings flashing white before it vanished into the sky. I watched it until it disappeared, then turned toward the road. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new. The revenge was complete. The healing had begun. And for the first time in years, I knew exactly where I was going. The morning after the deed arrived, I woke before the sun and lay still, listening to the hush that fills a house when everyone is sleeping. It was the kind of quiet that used to frighten me. Now it felt like a soft room where I could rest my thoughts. I made tea and sat at the table with a blank page. For a long time, I did nothing but breathe and watch the window light. When the first thin line of gold touched the sill, I wrote 3 words, I am here. Healing began there, not with a ceremony or a vow, but with the simple act of not running from myself. The days that followed were small and honest. I cooked on purpose. I walked by the water without a phone in my hand. I set a chair beside the window and read until the light moved away from my shoulder. Hazel noticed. She said the house sounded different, as if the walls were listening again. Clarissa called to check on us. She told me the restraining order was holding and that Gareth had enrolled in a program out of state. The details were sparse. I felt no triumph when I heard it, only a steady relief that the ground under my feet would stay ground for a while. When we hung up, she sent a short message. Rest is work too. At the church, I asked the pastor if the community ever needed help with small renovations. He laughed softly and said buildings always need someone who understands light. He walked me through the classrooms and the hallways. The paint was dull and the windows sticky with old tape. I ran my hand along the sill and imagined what color would look like when children walked in on a Tuesday morning. We made a list and printed it, and the paper felt like the first blueprint I had held in years. On Saturdays, Hazel and I drove to the lot. She brought a sketchbook and sat in the grass while I walked the edges and measured with my feet. We did not talk about the old house. We talked about where the lemon tree might go. We talked about a window that would catch the sunrise in winter. We drew rectangles and soft corners and a long table for noisy dinners. I kept every page she drew as if it were a permit. One afternoon, the mail brought a letter with an unfamiliar return address. I almost placed it aside unopened, but my name on the envelope had a kind of careful neatness that made me pause. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was Gareth, but it looked steadier than I remembered. Opal, I am writing from the program where I am staying. They asked us to list harms and name them in plain language. I do not know if this letter helps you, but it helps me to put words in the right place. I used control to hide fear. I used money to buy power. I used your love as a guarantee. I tore down a house to prove I did not need history. I am not asking you to forgive me or to make room for me. I am asking only that you know I finally see what I did. I am sorry for the harm I caused you and Hazel. If there is a way for me to repair anything that does not include contact, tell me through your lawyer. I will listen. Gareth, I read it once and then read it again, not to search for a trick, but to hear it without the noise of my old anger. The words did not mend anything, and they were not meant to. They were a record, and records have value when people stop lying. I placed the letter with my mother and sat quietly with both. Forgiveness did not arrive like a sudden light. It came as a looseness in my chest that let air in where it had been tight for too long. That night, I told Hazel that I had heard from her father. I did not hand her the letter. I told her its gist and waited. She asked if he sounded like himself. I said he sounded like a person trying to use new words. She nodded and went back to her homework. Later, she came into the living room and leaned against my shoulder. Do you think people change? I said I think people can learn, and that learning takes time and truth. She accepted that and stayed beside me until the credits of a movie rolled silently across the screen. A month passed. I returned to work in a careful way. The church project grew into a small network of community fixes. A widow needed a railing on her porch. A daycare wanted a reading nook cut from a corner that always felt forgotten. A local shelter asked if we could sketch a sleeping space that did not feel like a gym floor. Every task used something I had stored away while I was busy surviving. I felt like a well that had been covered for years and now welcomed hands again. I met other women in quiet rooms. Some had bruises under sleeves. Some had voices that shook only on the last word of a sentence. We did not trade tragedies like a currency. We traded tools. One woman taught me a breathing exercise she used before court. I taught her a way to stand when someone tries to make you smaller. We promised never to congratulate one another for pain, only for clarity. At night I sketched. The new house did not announce itself all at once. It arrived the way dawn does, line by line. The plan was not grand. It was honest. The kitchen held the heart of it. A long counter for tea and homework and late-night apples. A window low enough that a child could watch rain in a good chair. A threshold that opened to a garden where lemon and rosemary would make the air a kind of medicine. I put my drafting pencil down and cried without fear when the kitchen finally felt right. Grief left quietly each time a room came into focus. Clarissa and I met for coffee after one of my site visits. She looked less like a lawyer and more like a friend who had watched a storm lift. She asked if I wanted to respond to Gareth's letter. I told her I would send a single sentence through her office. I wish you healing that does not require me to be your proof. She smiled and said boundaries are a kind of architecture too. The next week brought another note from the program. This time it was addressed to Hazel and sent to Clarissa first. He had written a few lines about being her father without asking for a reply. He did not ask to see her. He said he would respect whatever choice she made with me. I read it alone first. Then I placed it on the table with a glass of water and called her in. She read it slowly and then looked at me. I asked her what she wanted. She said she wanted to send back one sentence. I hope you keep learning. We wrote it down together. Clarissa mailed it for us. The church walls took paint beautifully. On a Tuesday afternoon, I stood on a ladder while the custodian passed me a tray and told me how his mother used to clean houses by the hour and taught him to make even the plainest room feel safe. People came and went, leaving the air humming with calm work. When the last coat went on, light pooled in the hall in a way it had not pooled there in years. A teacher walked through the doorway and cried at the sight of it. She said her students would think morning had changed. We laughed. We both knew it was the same morning, finally allowed to enter. Healing also meant telling the truth to my own body. I began to run again, not far, a mile along the water at first light. The shore smelled like salt and clean stone. I kept a slow pace and counted the sound of my feet. My lungs expanded and emptied. Each inhale was a way to say yes. Each exhale was a way to say no. Once, when rain began suddenly and I had no coat, I laughed aloud and kept going. It was the first time I had laughed like that in a long time, a sound that belonged to no one else. One evening, I found the small wind chime from Hazel's old room in the drawer where I had placed it after the lot visit. We cleaned it and hung it on the temporary porch of our rental. The first night it rang, Hazel called me outside, and we stood under the faint music. We did not talk. We let the small sound tell us that air moves even when walls are still. A counselor from the program called to confirm boundaries and to offer a mediated update. Gareth was continuing with treatment. He had joined a group that focused on accountability. There would be no outreach beyond letters through legal channels. I thanked the counselor and told her that the distance was part of the medicine. She understood immediately. It was the first time I had felt that a stranger had stepped into the room of my life and not rearranged a single chair. Summer arrived soft and early. We planted herbs in mismatched pots and a few scraggly sunflowers that grew taller than the fence before they decided to tilt their heads toward us. Hazel had a friend over and they drew chalk houses on the driveway. Their rooms had slides and hidden doorways and beds that floated on strings from the ceiling. When they were done, they called me to look. I took a picture from the window because even chalk deserves to be remembered when it makes a child proud. I began the process with a builder I trusted, someone who listened more than he talked. We stood on the lot with a roll of white paper spread across the hood of his truck. He pointed to soil samples and I pointed to the sky. We talked about how wind moves in winter and where the grass will lie down during a storm. He told me construction begins with a hole that looks like damage but is actually the shape of what will hold. I smiled and said that I knew that feeling well. There were days when grief returned. It always will. I would reach for a bowl that used to sit in my mother's cabinet and my hand would meet air. I would hear a song in a grocery store and have to stand still until the aisle stopped blurring. On those days, I made soup and called my sister and let myself be ordinary. No winning, no losing, only living through another evening. It turns out that healing grows best in ordinary soil. Hazel asked one night if we could drive past the old street without stopping. We did. We moved slow, our windows down, and let the scent of fir trees roll in. Where the house had stood there was still an open wound of dirt, but the edges were beginning to soften with grass. She squeezed my hand and said she was ready for new footsteps. I told her me too. We did not say anything else. There was nothing to add. Something changed in me when I realized I could wish good things for the world that also held Gareth. Not because I wanted him near, not because I was forgetting, but because I had room again to hope without needing to erase anyone to feel strong. That was the day I understood forgiveness as a quiet that belongs to me. I do not have to hand it to him like a key. I can keep it and still live with the door open to air. On the first cool evening of late summer, Clarissa came over for dinner. We ate on the back steps because the table was covered in paper and pencils and the beginnings of a kitchen. Hazel brought out a cake she had baked with too much vanilla and we ate it anyway. When the sky went from blue to the color of a ripe plum, Clarissa pulled 2 folded papers from her bag. The permits had cleared. The builder could schedule groundbreaking. I held the papers in both hands. They were light, and yet I could feel the weight of what they meant. We clinked our forks together and laughed. Before bed, I stood at the window and looked out at the dark yard. The wind moved the leaves in one tree and left the others still, as if it were teaching me how to pay attention. In the glass, I saw my face and remembered the woman who once begged a closed door to open. I lifted my hand and placed my palm on the pane. I did not need to speak to know the prayer. Thank you for the ruin that taught me to build. The call came the next morning from the program director. Gareth had asked to send a final letter before he moved to a sober living facility. It was short. He thanked me for allowing distance. He said he would not contact us again unless Hazel asked through legal channels when she turned 18. He said he had found a volunteer shift repairing bikes for kids and that fixing small things made sense to him in a way big things never had. I set the letter on the table and went for a walk. When I returned, the wind had pushed it slightly askew. I straightened it and felt a calm I trusted. On the day we broke ground, the sun rose pale and kind. The builder arrived early with the crew. Clarissa brought coffee and took a picture of Hazel and me holding a small shovel together. I thought I would cry, but what I felt was a clean energy that ran steady from my feet to my hands. The first cut of the earth looked like a scar at the start of healing, pink and honest. The machine rumbled and the ground changed shape, and with each careful scoop, the future became more visible. Hazel whispered that the hole looked like the beginning of a heart. I told her that is exactly what it is. We stood in the soft noise of work and let the moment sink into us. I pressed a fragment of the old wind chime into the soil at the corner where the kitchen would be, not as a relic, but as a note. The past can sing without ruling the room. When the crew paused for lunch, the lot grew still again. I walked its perimeter slowly and felt gratitude for every step that had led me back to this place. The shape of the rooms was only chalk on dirt, but I could feel them anyway. A house does not begin when walls go up. It begins when someone imagines a safe place and then refuses to abandon that imagining. I went home tired in the best way. Hazel fell asleep on the couch with her hair across her face. I tucked the blanket around her and sat with a cup of water and the window open to the evening. My mother's letter lay on the table beside the new permits. The words on both looked like they belonged together. Broken bricks, strong walls, clear skies. Healing had not erased what happened. It had given me back the pen. Tomorrow there would be lumber and schedules and the patient work of raising beams. Tomorrow there would be choices about tile and door swings and where to place the light switches so that reaching for them in the dark would feel like second nature. Tomorrow there would be noise and mud and the quiet pride of progress measured in inches. For now, I closed my eyes and listened to the small sounds of a good night. Somewhere in the yard, a cricket tried out its song. Somewhere down the block, someone watered a garden and the hose hissed like a soft reminder that care is a daily thing. I whispered thank you again, to the woman I had been, to the woman I was becoming, and to the house that had waited for me inside the ruins all along. I am here. I am building. The first walls went up in October. I still remember the sound, wood meeting wood, nails finding their place, a rhythm like heartbeats sinking after a long silence. The builder called me over that morning and said, "This is when it starts to feel real." He was right. Standing there with Hazel, watching the skeleton of our new home rise, I felt something inside me shift. The land that once carried the memory of destruction was now learning to hold creation again. Hazel danced between the beams, her laughter echoing through the open frame. She pointed to one wall and said, "This will be my room. I want the bed under the window so I can see the stars." "You'll have them," I said, smiling, "all of them." The workers hammered and lifted while the sun climbed higher. I stayed until evening, long after the crew left, running my hands along the raw wood. The air smelled of sawdust and beginnings. I closed my eyes and whispered to the space, "We made it." When November came, the roof followed. Rain threatened to delay the work, but every day the clouds seemed to wait until after sunset before breaking. Clarissa called it poetic justice. "Even the weather on your side," she teased. She visited the site one Sunday with her daughter. We drank coffee in the driveway, the unfinished house behind us glowing in the soft afternoon light. "You've come full circle," she said. "Maybe not full," I replied. "Just far enough to see the horizon again," she smiled. "That's what rebirth looks like. Not erasing the past, just building something strong enough to hold it." By December, the walls were painted. Hazel chose pale yellow for her room, the color of early morning. I picked white for mine, not sterile white, but warm, the kind that absorbs sunlight. The kitchen, though, I left unfinished on purpose. I wanted to feel the process stretch a little longer to stay connected to the making. The house wasn't large. It didn't need to be. Every corner had a purpose, every window framed something worth looking at: the ocean, the lemon tree we'd planted, the slope of sky where birds gathered before dusk. One evening, as we unpacked boxes, Hazel found the small wind chime again. It had followed us like a witness through every stage of our story. We hung it by the front door. When it rang that night, I laughed softly. "That sound," I told her, "means we're home." Christmas arrived quietly. We didn't host a party or fill the house with decorations. We just cooked dinner, lit candles, and played a record my mother used to love. The music filled the kitchen, and for a moment, time folded the past and the present breathing together. Hazel handed me a small envelope. Inside was a drawing, our new house, surrounded by trees and birds, the words "strong walls," soft hearts written in careful handwriting. "Where did you hear that?" I asked. "You said it once," she replied. I liked it. I hugged her tightly. "It's the best gift I've ever received." Winter passed gently. I kept working on the community projects, drawing, teaching small workshops about design and emotional architecture. People came to learn about space, but they stayed to talk about healing. One woman said she'd never realized how much a window could change the way she felt about herself. I told her that light doesn't just enter, it listens. Each day I grew stronger, not because life became easy, but because I finally trusted my own foundation. There were still moments of ache, songs that reminded me of what was lost, letters I never sent, but they didn't crush me anymore. They became part of the structure, the invisible beams holding up the roof of who I was becoming. In early spring, a letter arrived from the rehabilitation center. Gareth had completed the program. He wasn't asking for contact, only sending confirmation for legal closure. At the bottom, he wrote a final line: "I hope your new house is full of light." I read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. There was no anger, no fear, just quiet acknowledgement. Maybe he had finally learned that some homes are not meant to be returned to, only remembered for what they taught us. The day the construction finished, the builder handed me the keys. "Every story leaves a mark," he said. "But this one feels clean," I nodded. "Clean doesn't mean untouched, it just means honest." We walked through the rooms together. The air still smelled of paint and fresh wood. In the kitchen, Hazel stood by the counter, tracing circles on the marble. "Can we cook now?" she asked. I laughed. "Yes, let's make something simple." We baked bread that night, our laughter mixing with the hum of the oven. When we pulled the loaf out, the crust cracked softly, releasing steam like breath after a long silence. "This," I said, breaking off a piece and handing it to her, "is what rebuilding tastes like." Later, when she went to bed, I stood outside under the porch light. The chime swayed gently, its soft ringing drifting across the night. Above me, the stars shimmered, distant, patient, forgiving. I thought about the woman who had once knelt in the rubble of her old life, clutching a piece of wood and whispering promises to herself. I wanted to tell her she'd make it here, that the ruins would one day be the foundation of something radiant. The wind brushed against my face, and I smiled. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering differently. Months later, the house became more than a home, it became a symbol. People from the community visited, bringing flowers, books, stories. Some came because they'd heard about the court case, others because they simply wanted to stand somewhere that had survived. One evening, Clarissa came by again, this time without work folders. She brought a small gift wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a plaque that read, "The Leon home built from broken bricks." I laughed through my tears. "You remembered." "I always do," she said, "and so will you." We sat on the porch until the sun dipped below the ocean. The house glowed behind us, warm and alive. Hazel's laughter carried through the windows. Clarissa stood to leave. "You know," she said, "I think your mother would have loved this view." "I think so too," I whispered. When she drove away, I stayed outside a while longer, barefoot on the wooden floor, feeling the pulse of everything that had led me here, the pain, the loss, the fire, the rebuilding. Life had not erased the scars. It had made them part of the design. And as the stars bloomed above the roofline, I realized I wasn't just healed. I was reborn. 5 years later, the lemon tree in our yard had grown taller than the roofline. Each spring it filled the air with a sweetness so thick that the whole house smelled like sunlight. Hazel called it the forgiveness tree. I liked that. It reminded me that everything we nurture, pain or hope, eventually flowers into what it was meant to be. Our home had become a living thing. The wind chimes still sang on the porch, soft and sure, and the sound followed me into every morning. I had learned to take it as a greeting, not a memory. The walls had grown familiar, filled with sketches, laughter, quiet music. Some days I would catch myself tracing the grain of the kitchen counter, remembering how empty my hands once felt and how full they were now. Hazel was 13. She had my eyes and her father's curiosity. She built model houses out of cardboard and paint, tiny worlds where she could decide what stayed and what opened. Once she showed me one with walls that folded out like wings. "No one gets trapped," she said. "Every room has a door." "You're better at this than I was," I told her. She smiled. "You just built with heavier things." I didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. I still met Clarissa for coffee every few months. Her daughter was in college now, and Clarissa had taken up pottery. "Law teaches you how to fight," she said once, "but clay teaches you how to yield." She asked about Gareth only once, carefully, as if touching an old scar. I told her he still sent updates through the center, short factual notes about his progress, never crossing boundaries. He worked with a nonprofit that repaired old community bikes. "Do you think he's changed?" she asked. "I think he's learning," I said, "and learning is a kind of change." She nodded. "And you, still building?" "Always," I said, "just slower now, with intention." In the evenings, I taught design at the community college. My students came from everywhere: single parents, retirees, young people with more talent than confidence. I told them that architecture is not just about walls, but about how people move through them. A good space, I said, doesn't control you. It invites you. One night after class, a student stayed behind. She was quiet, nervous. She said she had left an abusive marriage and didn't know how to start again. I looked at her and saw the ghost of the woman I had been. I told her that starting again isn't a single act, it's 1,000 small permissions. One day, you wake up and realize you no longer wait for someone else to tell you you're allowed to breathe. When she left, I sat in the empty classroom and felt the strange, steady warmth of knowing that pain, once survived, can become instruction. Spring turned to summer. The town changed around us: new shops, new faces, a park rebuilt where an old warehouse once stood. I helped design the benches there. They curved gently, inviting conversation. When the park opened, the mayor thanked the architect of resilience. I laughed when I heard it. Titles never mattered. What mattered was seeing children run on grass that used to be concrete. One day, while walking through that park, I saw Gareth. He was fixing a bike under the shade of an elm, his hands black with grease. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he stood and nodded, not as a plea, but as a greeting. I nodded back. There was nothing to say. No bitterness, no victory, no debt left unpaid, just two people who had lived through a fire and come out changed. Hazel saw him too. Later that evening she asked, "Did it hurt to see him?" "No," I said, "it didn't." "Do you forgive him?" "I already did," I answered. "But that forgiveness isn't for him, it's for me, for us." She looked thoughtful. "So we're free now?" "Yes," I said, "completely." Years continued to pass quietly, like pages turning themselves. Hazel grew into a young woman with paint on her hands and dreams bigger than the town. She applied to study environmental design and got in. The night before she left for college, she stood on the porch, touching the wind chime one last time. "Do you think the house will miss me?" she asked. I smiled. "Maybe a little, but houses don't hold people, they hold their echoes." She laughed. "Then it'll never be empty." I watched her leave the next morning, her car fading down the road lined with lemon blossoms. The ache I felt wasn't sorrow. It was pride stretched wide enough to touch the horizon. In the quiet that followed, I began to write. Not just sketches or notes, but a book part memoir, part reflection. I called it Rebuilding from Broken Bricks. It wasn't about Gareth or revenge. It was about how to find light when every wall around you has fallen. I wrote for the women who still whispered their pain into locked phones, for the daughters who would one day build homes that listened. When it was published, the first copy arrived by mail. I placed it on the kitchen counter beside my mother's old teacup. The lemon tree's reflection shimmered in the window. The wind chime sang once, soft and clear, as if giving its blessing. I sent one copy to the rehabilitation center, addressed to the volunteer program. No note, no signature, just the book. It was enough. The years kept their rhythm. Seasons folded neatly into each other. The house aged beautifully, the paint fading to a shade I liked even more than the original. The cracks that appeared near the stairs didn't bother me. They felt like the home breathing, expanding with time. On the 5th anniversary of our move-in, I hosted a small gathering. Clarissa came, radiant in her linen dress. The pastor who had given me my first design job at the church came too, carrying a basket of lemons from our tree. Neighbors filled the rooms with laughter. When the sun went down, I raised a glass and said, "This house isn't perfect, but it's alive, and that's all I ever wanted." Everyone clapped softly. Clarissa leaned in and whispered, "You rebuilt more than walls, Opal. You rebuilt the way people believe in surviving." I looked around the room, the walls, the light, the sound of Hazel's old music playing through the speakers, and thought maybe that's what legacy really is. Not fame, not victory, just proof that something broken can become beautiful again. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood on the porch. The air was cool and smelled of lemon and rain. The wind chime moved gently. I thought of my parents, of Gareth, of every version of myself that had walked through pain and still chosen to build. I whispered into the dark, "It's all right now." And the wind answered softly, carrying the sound through the trees, over the roof, into the endless sky. Inside, the house glowed, warm, steady, whole. I turned off the light, closed the door, and smiled. Because I knew, finally, that the story wasn't about loss. It was about how loss becomes light.